Thank you very much. I hope it's not a speech. I'll try to be as concise as I can. First of all, my thanks to Lemhanas for organising this wonderful event. I'm honoured to be here, and thank you to my fellow panellists. I'm from the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and the Lowy Institute is an independent think tank, research organisation. And that means all our scholars, all our experts speak their minds. There is no Lowy Institute view of the world. We all write and say what we think about how the world works, and sometimes we disagree with each other, and sometimes we debate with each other publicly. And in fact, the remarks that I'm going to make today are the subject of debate and controversy in Australia, because as I'm sure many of you know, Australia is a very close ally of the United States, and it's becoming much closer. In fact, since the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, the Australian alliance with the United States has become as close, as intimate as it's ever been, and that was reinforced, of course, again last year by the announcement of the AUKUS agreement. And I hope in the question and answer period we get a chance to talk about AUKUS. I've got a lot to say on that subject. And I'm sure you have your own thoughts about it. I'll begin very briefly with just some remarks about China, because I think the two factors, China and the US, are the two critical factors in the future of maritime security in Southeast Asia. Very briefly though on China, because I think the facts here are not really in dispute, and we heard already about China's rise as a maritime power. This is not too controversial, so I'll be very brief. China is already, by some measures, the largest economy in the world, and certainly will be the largest economy in the world in the 2030s. And by reasonable projections, it will be the most powerful. It will have the most powerful navy and perhaps the most powerful armed forces in the world by 2040. It is certainly developing capabilities to conduct sustained maritime operations in what are referred to as blue waters. That is, global maritime operations that can be sustained for long periods and project significant military power over very long distances. We've seen, for instance, the development of an aircraft carrier program, and I think in a very short few years we will start to see China conduct long-range operations centred around its aircraft carriers, which will go throughout the Asian region and into Southeast Asia as well. I think we don't, of course, know what China's ultimate political ambitions are for its power in the region. China itself is very opaque about this question, but I think we can say quite safely that no country of China's size wants to be second or subsidiary to another power in its own region. Historically, great powers have sought leadership roles. They have sought status that is equal to its economic size. And so I think we can safely predict that that is what China wants. And that means effectively that it will need to outrank the United States, and also, I think, eventually push the United States out of Asia. Typically, we're told that those kind of ambitions are going to create a clash with the United States, a struggle for hegemony, as we heard earlier. I'd like to offer a slightly different point of view, and so I'll turn my remarks now to the United States. A typical example of how the United States states its role in Asia came in the Indo-Pacific Strategy in 2022, released by the Biden administration, where the document argued that the lesson from World War II was that the US cannot be secure unless Asia is secure. And I just want to ask, in these few more minutes that I have, whether that is actually really true. And the first reason I think to doubt whether that's true is that America's military posture in Asia has basically not changed very much in the post-Cold War period. So in the last 30 years, we've seen truly massive changes in the strategic order in Asia. We had, first of all, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and thereafter we have, as already discussed, the rise of China as an economic and a strategic power. And I would add a third factor, which is that North Korea has become a nuclear power with the ability, I should add, to deliver a nuclear warhead onto any target in the United States, any American city. So the North Koreans have an ICBM capability. Now that, I think, those three factors together represent a complete transformation of the strategic order in Asia. And yet, as I've already said, in that period, America's military posture in Asia has barely changed. The troop numbers in Korea and in Japan have shifted a little bit around the edges, but they're roughly the same. So I think that's the first reason to question whether the United States really does believe in its heart that for America to be secure, Asia must be secure. After all, if the entire region has transformed itself strategically in that time, you would think the United States would have responded. But I think basically it has not, despite rhetorical changes. I think it's also worth just questioning the idea that militarily America cannot be secure unless Asia is secure. After all, America's a long way away. It's surrounded by two vast oceans, friendly neighbours, north and south. It has a huge military force, thousands of nuclear weapons, and a very strong economy to support them. Sometimes it's also said that America's security presence in Asia is essential in order to help its allies secure themselves. But of course, that gets the whole idea of alliances completely backwards. The whole reason that the United States struck alliances with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, not to mention NATO countries and others, is that these alliances ultimately serve America's national interests. If they no longer serve those interests, then I would say those alliances have served their purpose and are no longer a core interest of the United States. Sometimes it's also argued that economics is a strong reason for the United States to remain militarily engaged in Asia. Well, I think firstly it's important to say that the United States in relation or in comparison to its peers, to other OECD countries, the United States has a very self-sufficient economy. It is not particularly trade dependent. It is not particularly energy independent, particularly since the fracking revolution of earlier this century. I think it's also worth pointing out that European powers were once militarily very significant in this part of the world, but that went backwards in the early post-war period in the decolonisation process, and yet European powers remain incredibly important economic partners here in Asia. So it seems to me there's no reason to think that the United States, if it left the region tomorrow militarily, would not remain a very important economic partner for all Asian countries, including China. It would be very difficult and very costly for China to try to exclude the United States from the region economically, even if the United States was not a major military power. Possibly the best argument that I've heard for why America must remain a military power in Asia is that it suppresses the prospects of nuclear proliferation. So I think it is reasonable to argue that if the United States ever left Asia militarily, that Japan would develop an independent nuclear deterrent. And if Japan did it, South Korea would probably do it as well. It's possible, there's been some speculation in fact in Australia, that Australia would choose that route. If it could no longer rely on America's extended nuclear deterrent, then Australia might have to develop an independent nuclear deterrent as well. And I would think if Australia ever went down that road, then Indonesia would develop a nuclear deterrent of its own as well. Now, these are speculative thoughts. They are not likely, but I think they are a good indication of why the United States believes that if it ever left the region militarily, that this would have severe consequences for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. So that's a reasonable concern, but it seems to me not a strong enough reason for the United States to remain in and of itself. to take on a whole of government, multi-generational struggle, competition with China, an economy and a society and a military that's as large as China, you need to have a very, very good reason. And I don't think non-proliferation is quite a good enough reason. Ideologically, sometimes it's argued that China represents an ideological threat to the United States. So I don't think that's persuasive either. China ultimately is really a defensive ideological power. It has no evident ambitions to spread communist ideology around the world. It is definitely fearful of Western ideology infecting China, but that is essentially a defensive mindset. So I don't think the United States has much to fear from China ideologically. So altogether, I think the argument that, as I put it at the beginning, that for the US to be secure, Asia must be secure, I don't think that argument really holds much water. I would stress, though, that I'm not making an argument here about American weakness. The US is in fact incredibly strong, and that's one reason why I think ultimately it will choose not to compete with China. The United States is a massive economy with a very young population, a culture of innovation that I think will sustain it over the long term. It doesn't need to compete with China in order to sustain those advantages and those strengths. Now, what does all of that mean for Southeast Asia? Very briefly. Well, I think first of all what it means is that Southeast Asian countries, and particularly Indonesia, will have to do more of this work itself. If Southeast Asian powers want to maintain a strategic balance in their region, they cannot rely on the United States to do it for them. I think one thing that separates Southeast Asia from the broader Asian region is that there is no resident great power in Southeast Asia. So wherever China looks on the map of Asia, its ambitions, I think, will be constrained by other great powers. India, of course, in the Indian Ocean and in South Asia. Russia, of course, will be a constraint on Chinese ambitions in Central Asia. And then, of course, Japan in maritime North Asia will be a constraint. But Southeast Asia is different because there is no resident great power. I would argue, though, that Indonesia must become that great power in Southeast Asia. We heard earlier Indonesia referred to as a middle power, and I think that's true at the present moment. But Indonesia is the only country in this region with all the ingredients to become a great power. In fact, there are, I think, reasonable predictions that Indonesia will become the fourth largest economy in the world by the middle of this century, and that alone suggests that Indonesia will become a great power. From an Australian perspective, I think it's very much in our interests for Indonesia to take on that position of being the resident great power in this region. And that means not just economic size, but it means also taking on responsibilities to be a balancing power in this region. Now, I understand that that's not a particularly popular sentiment in Indonesia, the idea of Indonesia becoming a balancing power. But I would stress that for Indonesia, that does not mean that it needs to be confrontational with China. It does not mean that it needs to be aggressive with China. In fact, I think what it means is that for Indonesia, it does need more hard power tools, but they don't need to be the kind of tools that provoke arms racing or that provoke reactions from China. I think Australia, in fact, offers a lesson here because Australia has, I think, taken the wrong path in recent years. We are developing a military posture that is, in my view, too aggressive and too assertive, with long-range strike capabilities. We are investing in hypersonic weapons. We have, our previous government announced that it would arm our destroyers with long-range cruise missiles. We have, of course, now invested in the AUKUS relationship, which will include at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines with very long range, also with land attack cruise missile capabilities. I think these kind of weapon systems send the wrong signal to the region. I think we can develop a force structure that is much more defensive in orientation, we can take a lesson from the kind of force structure that China itself developed in the early phase of its maritime modernisation, one that is focused on area denial. And that, in fact, I think offers a model for Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries as well. In the maritime sphere, the natural advantage goes to the defending power, the power that is not seeking to project power but to defend its coasts. It is much easier to, and cheaper, I would argue, to be a defensive maritime power than to be an offensive maritime power. And that is the kind of course that I would recommend for Southeast Asian states. The kind of course that I think will allow military issues to be put in the background in the relationship between China and the region, so that the region, the Southeast Asian region, Indonesia in particular, can pursue constructive relations with China based on compromise and cooperation. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.